Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, in my opinion, has a fantastic story. It does a great job of covering material in the OG7 after the Midgar section up until the infamous moment. By the way, spoilers for everything FF7 related. Rebirth does such a fantastic job of not just breathing new life into the existing 7 story in this section and intertwining new plot elements to keep the mystery going, but even tightening up certain sections of the story from the original 7 that were very questionable. Like, I think about the Keystone Hunt from the original 7 and how when you go to like that one guy's random house on the world map and the guy's like, oh, this is where the Keystone is. In Rebirth, that whole weird element is just gone completely, just naturally integrated into the story. However, a lot of people are not going to share my perspective on the story, and it's not necessarily for the reasons that you'd think. Because I see online in a lot of comment sections and forum posts that a lot of newer people to the FF7 universe who maybe only played Remake and are going into this game are really struggling with the narrative of the early section of Rebirth. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about a lot of the lack of a core narrative thrust in the early parts of Rebirth. So the section of the original FF7 that Rebirth adapts and covers is a little bit of an odd section from a narrative standpoint. Once you get out of Midgar and you get the Nibelheim flashback, there is a loose narrative motivation set in the original game that you obviously want to go out of your way to stop Sephiroth from doing all of these horrible things to the rest of the planet based on what Cloud has told you. Now, what's really interesting is that the reasoning why that the party, and by extension, you, the player, should care about going after Sephiroth differs between the OG7 and the remake games, interestingly enough. So in the OG7, after Sephiroth does his stabby stab on President Shinra and the party is interrogating Palmer, Palmer says that Sephiroth mentions the Promised Land as he's walking through and does his whole rampage. Now, if you might be a little rusty in FF7 lore, I don't entirely blame you, but remember that the Promised Land is the minor plot point that pops up in both the OG7 and the remake games. It's this idea of like, kind of the afterlife and the way the Cetra talk about it.
Their scripture too has endured. We who are born of the planet, with her we speak, her flesh we shape. Unto her promised land shall we one day return.
Shinra is really obsessed with the Promised Land because they take the land part of that extremely literally, as part of like a copium, I guess, for them sucking all of the Mako out of the planet. They're like, guys, there's obviously an undiscovered part of the planet that we don't know how to access, that like the Cetra will lead us to, and that we will get access to all of this Mako and get us keep pumping it forever and not have to worry about it anymore.
Are they out there watching us, waiting for us to join them in some blessed corner of the world? A green and verdant land where boundless Mako energy will provide for our every need. Shinra is working for you to fulfill the hope of the ancients and lead us to that promised land.
Sephiroth is also after the Promised Land. And given what Cloud knows about Sephiroth, that it's presumably for bad reasons, probably to destroy the planet in general, which is, I guess, a little bit clunky story logic, but I think it works. My only real nitpick with this line of logic as to why the party chases after Sephiroth is that I think on a first-time playthrough, it just doesn't make any sense to a new player, that it only makes sense when you've absorbed all of the FF7 lore after the fact and you know what the Promised Land is, and you kind of understand Shinra's goals and motivations and Sephiroth's and how they kind of align and stuff. But for like a first-time player, it's like, wait, why are we chasing after this guy instead of fighting the obviously like way more powerful, evil, big Shinra corporation? Now, in comparison, the way that the remake games justify chasing after Sephiroth is a way more blunt. They literally just have Aerith spell it out for you.
He'd tell you that he only cares about the planet, that he'd do everything in his power to protect and preserve it. But this isn't the way it's supposed to be. There's no greater threat to the planet than him.
And I think in this case, it mostly works, even for a first-time player. Aerith knows how to communicate with the planet, so she would seemingly generally know what Sephiroth's deal is. So once we get all this done, go to Calm, have the Nibelheim flashback, establish Sephiroth's deal, then we're off to stop Sephiroth. Kind of. A large chunk of this original section of 7 is devoted to fleshing out these characters and building out their backstories. Whether it's Cosmo Canyon with Red 13, or going to Corel with Barret, and then the subsequent Gold Saucer stuff and Dyne. So this part of the story is designed in a certain way, where there is this ever-present looming threat of Sephiroth kind of out there in the distance, but it is not so dire and imminent that the party has to stop everything that they're doing and focus exclusively on that. That they can get caught up in all of this side stuff and do all of this that goes and develop their characters without it feeling particularly weird that they're doing it. So narratively, if there is a much more imminent and immediate threat in order to get the player a little bit more narratively invested in the stakes of the story, then why would the characters even be doing any of the Gold Saucer stuff or that leads to Dyne in the first place, right? And so the lack of this much narrative thrust in this section of the OG7 is fine, actually, because it is a smaller part of a whole single narrative. However, when it comes to Rebirth, this now goes from a minor nitpick in the original to a somewhat big problem. And so this is just another weird, interesting development of the FF7 Remake trilogy, because Rebirth is a much larger game in scope. And so something like 10 to 15 hours where the villain just kind of disappears for a while, where you develop, the backstories of the characters and the themes of the world is fine in a 40-hour JRPG. Now you have a 40-hour JRPG where most of it is in that awkward sort of zone where it's like, wait a minute, what am I doing? What's the point of me going out and meeting all these characters and the point of our quest again?
I'm waiting, Cloud.
Now, going into Rebirth, I think the people who wrote the game obviously knew that this was going to be a problem. And so there was some interesting opportunities, possibly, to just do something to try to alleviate this a little bit. But to me, what's so particularly fascinating is that the writing team, with all these potential options in front of them, just said, you know what, we're just gonna kind of leave things as is and really just only expand it out. Now, on one hand, I kind of understand why the development team made the choices that they did. That they thought that maybe with all of the stuff happening throughout the narrative, they didn't feel the need to adjust it. I mean, Chapter 2, you go fight the Midgar Swarmer and there's Sephiroth there. Chapter 5, you have to fight Genova and Sephiroth's there, right? So I can totally understand this from a certain perspective, just not messing with the overall narrative scenario too much, that if you kind of mess with that balance of threat to character development / theme building, that if you put too much of a threat to just kind of remind people and get people motivated to fight Sephiroth, that it might not really be FF7 anymore. But on the other hand, I feel like the results kind of speak for themselves, that it feels like some people might not be as engaged with the first 60% of Rebirth because of this decision. That yes, maybe on a macro level, it makes sense, but on a micro level, just moment-to-moment gameplay, keeping people engaged hour to hour, minute to minute, that this might not have been a good decision. And so Rebirth really lacks a core narrative thrust up until Chapter 9, or maybe even you could argue Chapter 10 with all of the Guy Black Materia stuff. That it feels like the story finally gets reinvigorated with a narrative thrust again. That's okay, we gotta fight Sephiroth and stop him from destroying the planet. It's really fascinating that Rebirth tries to frame the Guy Black Materia stuff as a sort of raising of the stakes in the third act, right? That similar to what Remake did with Shinra kidnapping Aerith after the plate collapses, where it's okay, now the stakes are high and we're gonna speed towards the conclusion. But part of the reason why the Guy Black Materia stuff just feels so awesome and cool is because now it feels like the story has sort of a purpose and a drive again in comparison to all of those hours prior to it. So in my opinion, despite me saying all of this stuff earlier, I really still think that Rebirth is a very strong narrative. But I do understand people's complaints as to why they feel the way that they do. That, at least for me, the character development and the lack of Sephiroth being a threat for many, many hours of the game is not a downside to me. But I can understand where people are coming from criticizing this game from the outside. So anyways, guys, that's it for the video. Did you like this discussion about this section of FF7 Rebirth? Did you have any problems with the fact that the narrative, like, stakes were not more omnipresent in, like, the first half of Rebirth? Comment down below what you think. Leave a like. You know, likes are always appreciated. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future from me. And hit up my Patreon down below to give me some of that cash money to incentivize me to make more videos like this in the future. Anyways, guys, that's it. And have a good day.